Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this and become part of our community. I want to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment telling us your city or country and share your impressions of the story. Every subscription and comment helps bring more mysteries and true stories to you. The mansion was set back from the main road, hidden by a corridor of ancient trees whose branches intertwined above the dirt path, forming a kind of natural tunnel. There were no signs, well-kept fences, or signs of recent life, yet county records indicated that the property was legally habitable and had been for sale for over 10 years, with no interested parties willing to complete the transaction. Ethan Caldwell arrived at the location on a cloudy autumn afternoon. The car engine was off, but he remained seated for a few seconds, observing the facade. 3 stories. Tall, symmetrical windows, almost all closed. The white paint was peeling, revealing old layers of different colors, as if the house had been repainted repeatedly to hide something that insisted on resurfacing. Ethan wasn't an adventurer, nor was he drawn to supernatural stories. He was a structural engineer, hired by an insurance company to assess properties involved in legal disputes. His work was technical, straightforward, based on data, cracks, calculations, and probabilities. The mansion entered his routine as just another old property with poorly documented problems. The conflict, however, was not in the written documents. The company that hired him had received an unusual request to assess whether the house posed an immediate structural risk or if it could be renovated and resold. The request came with contradictory reports. Some stated that the structure was surprisingly stable. Others described serious flaws, impossible to coexist in the same building. Floor plans that didn't match the actual measurements, rooms that appeared in old records and simply no longer existed. None of this was presented as a mystery, just as accumulated human error over the years. That's how Ethan saw it. He got out of the car, picked up his briefcase, and walked to the front door. The creaking of the outside floorboards was immediate, too loud for an empty house. He stopped, waiting for some echo or response. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the dry leaves. The door opened with unexpected ease. The interior of the mansion was cold, although there were no signs of excessive dampness. The air had a neutral, almost sterile smell, unlike the mold common in abandoned houses. The entrance hall was spacious, with a central staircase that split into 2 symmetrical flights. The wall clock, mounted above the unlit fireplace, showed 3:17. Ethan noted the detail automatically, more out of habit than curiosity. The antagonist in the story didn't present itself as a figure, but as a diffuse presence. The house itself. Everything there seemed to function according to its own logic, silent and resistant to quick interpretations. The floor didn't creak where it should, but it cracked in solid areas. The interior walls were thicker than expected, as if they had been reinforced beyond what was necessary. He started on the ground floor, measuring walls, testing the floor's resistance, and documenting everything with photos. The floor plan indicated an office next to the main room. In that location, there was only a smooth wall. No door, no signs of recent removal. Ethan went back to the paper and checked it again. The office was included in all versions of the original project. He moved on. As I moved through the rooms, small inconsistencies accumulated. Doors that led to spaces smaller than expected. Exterior windows that from the inside seemed to be offset a few centimeters to the left or right. It wasn't anything glaring, but enough to cause discomfort in someone accustomed to precision. The silence was strange, too. Not absolute silence, but the absence of ordinary sounds. No creaking of wood adjusting to the temperature, no distant noise from the road. It was as if the house absorbed sound. At the end of the main corridor, Ethan found a door that didn't appear on any floor plan. Dark wood, a simple iron doorknob, no sign of recent use. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but because it represented a serious documentation error. Upon opening the door, he found a narrow staircase leading down. The wristwatch showed 3:17. Ethan frowned, adjusted his watch, believing it was a minor malfunction. Still, he noted the fact. He descended a few steps, mindful of the uneven slope of the stairs. Before reaching the bottom, he heard a dry sound coming from upstairs, like something heavy being moved slowly. He stopped. He waited. Nothing happened. Ethan went back upstairs, determined to finish surveying the ground floor before investigating any noise. When he returned to the entrance hall, something had changed. The light coming through the windows seemed dimmer. The wall clock still showed 3:17. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt that this assessment wouldn't be resolved with just measurements and reports. The house didn't seem threatening, just incoherent. And for someone who relied on logic to understand the world, this was the beginning of a real problem. The mansion was built in the early 1920s, a period marked by industrial expansion and the emergence of large estates far from urban centers. County records indicated that the land had belonged to the Whitmore family, a surname that appeared frequently in old documents, but almost never in contemporary accounts. There were no recent photos of the former residents, only bureaucratic records. Purchases, renovations, taxes paid irregularly. Ethan uncovered part of this story upon accessing the main basement, a different route from the narrow staircase he had discovered earlier. There, boxes of files were stacked in a manner far too organized for an abandoned place. Inside them were architectural blueprints, supplier letters, and inspection reports signed by various engineers over 50 years. Many names were crossed out or illegible, as if the paper had been deliberately worn down at that point. The scene didn't convey abandonment, it conveyed disruption. While examining the blueprints, Ethan realized that the mansion had undergone constant renovations, but no significant external expansions. Even so, the interior dimensions varied from document to document. Some plans indicated an additional floor, others the removal of entire corridors. The dates didn't follow a linear logic. Later designs described structures that weren't present in the older ones, but which, physically, appeared older. The house hadn't grown, it had simply been reorganized. Among the documents, Margaret Whitmore's name appeared more frequently than others, not as the formal owner, but as the person responsible for structural decisions. Letters sent to architects and engineers revealed an obsessive concern with internal balance and adjustments necessary to keep the house functional. No technical explanation accompanied these requests. Ethan didn't judge. He assumed she was an eccentric heiress trying to preserve a property that was too big for her means. Still, he was struck by the fact that almost all the renovations had been done without final approved inspections. Upon reaching the second floor, he found clearer signs of past occupancy. A room with furniture covered in yellowed sheets, a comb forgotten on the dresser, nothing of value, but everything carefully arranged, as if someone had left with the intention of returning. There, the world of history became more intimate. Ethan began to notice patterns in the circulation. Some corridors always led to the same points, even when, theoretically, there were alternative paths. Secondary doors rarely aligned with corresponding doors on the other side. The house subtly, almost imperceptibly, directed the movement of those who passed through it. It was on this floor that he met the first living secondary character, Harold Myers, the caretaker assigned by the county for periodic external inspections. Harold hadn't been inside the mansion in years. He always waited outside, sitting in his truck, smoking and filling out generic reports. The encounter happened by chance when Ethan went to the side yard to check for cracks in the foundation. Harold approached slowly, keeping a comfortable distance. Their conversation was brief, almost purely functional. Harold explained that his job was simply to check for break-ins or fires. When Ethan commented on the internal inconsistencies, the man looked away and said only that The house has always been strange to those who try to understand it too much. There was no explicit fear in his speech, but there was conviction. Harold mentioned former residents who gave up on the property after only a few months. No reports of violence, no documented tragedies, just successive abandonment. People leaving saying that the house didn't stay the same overnight. Ethan dismissed the statement as an exaggeration. Upon returning inside, something small, yet significant, caught his attention. A second-floor door, which had previously led to an empty storage room, now opened onto a short corridor that ended at a window. He was certain that this corridor hadn't existed during his initial inspection. There was no shock, no panic, just a growing unease. The antagonism of the story was becoming clearer. There was no visible entity, nor an isolated event. The mansion behaved like a closed system, reacting to observation, reorganizing its own boundaries. Ethan began to understand that this was not an abandoned house waiting to be appraised. It was a structure that resisted being defined, and the more he measured, compared, and recorded, the more the world around him seemed to adjust, to invalidate his certainties. Ethan decided to remain in the mansion until all internal measurements were completed, even if it took longer than anticipated. The report needed to be finalized, and leaving without concrete answers would mean justifying flaws he still believed to be technical. The decision wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Still, it marked a point of no return. He resumed work on the third floor, the least documented in the blueprints found. Access was via a narrower staircase, with irregular steps and a worn handrail only on the right side, as if the flow of people had always been directed in a single way. Natural lighting there was weak, despite large windows. Light entered, but seemed to disperse before reaching the corners. The first obstacle arose when Ethan realized that the number of rooms didn't match any version of the records. There were too many doors. Some led to coherent spaces, small bedrooms, former staff dormitories, a narrow bathroom. Others opened onto rooms that made no functional sense whatsoever, rooms that were too long, without windows, with ceilings lower than the rest of the floor. Each new environment seemed to add a variable to the problem. While trying to map the floor, Ethan noticed that his wall marker, used to indicate measurement points, was beginning to disappear. Not gradually, as if someone had erased it, but as if it had never been there. He redid the markings twice, in strategic locations. When he returned minutes later, there was no sign of them. The first reaction was irritation, the second, doubt. The conflict intensified when he realized the sounds in the house had changed. Before, there had been constant silence. Now, there were spaced-out noises, light footsteps above him, even when he was on the top floor. Dry creaks coming from the interior walls. A rhythmic sound, almost like the slow movement of something heavy being dragged into another room. Ethan began to move more cautiously, not out of outright fear, but out of a need for control. Every new action needed to be double-checked. He started recording videos, quietly narrating what he saw, as if that would help solidify reality. Secondary characters began to interfere indirectly. Harold outside called Ethan in the middle of the afternoon, asking if he was still okay in there. The question sounded out of place. Ethan replied that he was, but noticed that the phone signal only fluctuated when he moved to certain areas of the house. On the second floor, the conflict took on another layer when Ethan found a room that appeared to have been recently occupied. The bed was made, there was an empty mug on the table, and the floor wasn't as dusty as the rest of the house. No documents indicated recent occupants. Upon leaving the room and returning minutes later, the door led to an old bathroom, with no trace of the previous space. The house wasn't just chaotic, it was active. Ethan tried to establish a fixed point. He chose the entrance hall as a reference point, as it was the most documented and visually stable space. He placed equipment there, a tripod, and measurements of height and width. For almost an hour, Everything remained consistent. The wall clock, still stopped at 3:17, served as a constant reminder that time there did not behave reliably. When Ethan went upstairs again, something had changed in the hallway. It wasn't obvious. The staircase looked the same, the floor untouched, but the distance between the fireplace and the front door was shorter. Not by perceptible centimeters, but enough that his footsteps arrived sooner than expected. Ethan's internal conflict began to manifest physically. He started sweating more, felt a dry throat and a slight pressure in his ears. There was no panic, but there was exhaustion. Each new inconsistency demanded an explanation, and none held up for long. The tension increased as he tried to leave the mansion to get some fresh air and clear his head. The main door opened normally, but the outside path didn't match what he had seen before. The tree-lined corridor seemed longer, more enclosed. Harold's truck was nowhere to be seen. Ethan went back inside immediately. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he wasn't dealing with isolated structural flaws, but with a system that reacted to human presence. The house didn't create direct violence. It created disorientation, wear and tear, a gradual loss of reference points. The antagonist grew stronger without revealing himself. Ethan was not being attacked, it was being tested. And every decision made within the mansion seemed to generate a silent response, reorganizing the space, imposing new obstacles, and making each attempt at control more fragile than the last. At the end of the day, he realized he could no longer say for sure how many rooms the house had, and this simple and objective observation marked the true beginning of the conflict. Ethan spent the night in the mansion not by conscious choice, but as a result of a series of small decisions that accumulated until leaving became impossible. His cell phone had permanently lost signal, and his wristwatch insisted on running slow whenever he moved away from the entrance hall. Still, the house offered everything he needed to stay: running water, unstable but functional electricity, and rooms that seemed ready for immediate use. One of the subplots began when Ethan decided to investigate the narrow staircase he discovered on the ground floor, the one that wasn't on any of the plans. The descent led him to an intermediate level, below the main basement, where the temperature was lower and the air denser. There, the walls were of rough stone, unlike the rest of the building. There were no signs of recent renovations in that space. At the end of the underground corridor, he found marks on the wall, parallel scratches at shoulder height, repeated for several meters. They didn't seem like random scratches. They were regular, almost methodical, as if someone had repeatedly walked the same path, always at the same spot, always in the same posture. The discovery raised a new layer of the conflict, the possibility that the house had been occupied without registration for long periods. Another subplot developed from the notes found in the boxes in the basement. Among technical reports and formal letters, Ethan located a handwritten notebook without a cover, with loose pages. The handwriting changed throughout the text, but the signature at the end of some passages was always the same: M. Whitmore. The notes didn't describe supernatural events, but everyday adjustments. Close the hallway when the noise starts. Don't measure the back room twice in the same day. The house reorganizes itself better when it's not directly observed. There were no explanations, only instructions. This subplot didn't derail the narrative. It reinforced the antagonism. Someone, decades earlier, had noticed the pattern and chosen to live with it instead of confronting it. Time pressure arose when Ethan realized his digital records were becoming corrupted. Videos had strange cuts, photos showed impossible angles, files saved minutes before simply disappeared. The sense of urgency intensified. If he couldn't quickly gather physical evidence, leaving with only verbal accounts would compromise his professional credibility. Meanwhile, Harold reappeared as an external subplot. The distant sound of the truck's engine was heard only once during the early morning hours, but when Ethan ran to a window, there was nothing but the empty road. Later, he found recent tire tracks in the mud, but no sign of prolonged stay. The house seemed to allow for outside approaches, but not direct encounters. Internally, Ethan's relationship with the space began to change. He started avoiding certain hallways without knowing exactly why. He always chose the same stairs, the same paths, as if he were being conditioned. In return, the house offered a false sense of stability, rooms that remained the same for longer, doors that didn't change function. It was a silent negotiation. Another subplot emerged, with the room that had previously appeared occupied. Upon returning to the room, Ethan found an old photograph on the table. In it, a group of people posed in front of the mansion. The image was faded, but one face stood out, a woman with a rigid posture looking directly at the camera. On the back, a single handwritten phrase, "The house demands constancy." Ethan recognized the last name written in the lower corner, Whitmore. These subplots converged on a common point. The house did not react to fear, but to the attempt to understand. The more Ethan sought to catalogue, measure, and define, the more unstable the environment became. When he simply accepted the flow, the changes diminished. Tension increased, not because of direct threats, but because of the constant need to adapt. Every choice had a cost. Every technological advance provoked a structural response. Ethan realized he wasn't just investigating a problematic mansion. I was participating in an ancient cycle, carefully maintained by generations who had learned to compromise in order to continue living there. The turning point didn't come with an abrupt event, but with a realization impossible to ignore. Ethan woke up at what he believed to be the early morning, although there was no perceptible change in the outside light. His wristwatch read 6:02 a.m. The wall clock, visible from the room where he had slept, remained motionless at 3:17 a.m. He woke up feeling like he'd slept for only a short time, even though his body indicated otherwise. As he left the room, he noticed something he hadn't considered before. The room was no longer on the second floor. The window looked out onto ground level. The trees in the outside corridor were at eye level. The house had rearranged the space while he slept. Ethan didn't panic. Instead, he did something different from anything he had done before. He stopped measuring. He put away the tape measure, turned off the camera, and placed his notebook in his backpack. He walked around the house without trying to record anything, just observing. The reaction was immediate. The hallways remained stable. The doors maintained their function. The dragging sound that occasionally arose ceased. For the first time since her arrival, the mansion seemed functional. That was the real shock. Ethan realized that the instability wasn't random. It was a direct response to the attempt at control. The house wasn't defending itself against physical intrusions, but against interpretations. It refused to be reduced to blueprints, numbers, and reports. The revelation gained weight when he found a room he had never seen before. A large room, in the exact center of the building, without windows or visible doors except for the one he had just passed through. In the middle of the room, there was a simple table, and on it, an organized set of documents. They weren't old. These were copies of his own preliminary reports, printed with handwritten corrections. Some observations were crossed out, others accompanied by small notes. Incorrect, redundant, unnecessary. The signature at the bottom was familiar. M. Whitmore. The antagonist ceased to be merely a strange space. It became an inherited system, maintained by people who had learned to interact with it. The house was not alive in the organic sense, but it was reactive, adaptive, and selective. Ethan understood that Margaret Whitmore had not been a victim. She had been a mediator. The turning point solidified when he tried to leave again. This time without equipment, without measurements, just with his backpack on his back. The main door opened onto the familiar road. Harold's truck was there, parked as if it had never left. Harold observed Ethan for a few seconds before speaking. He simply said that the house usually lets go of those who understand when to stop. and there was no further explanation. It wasn't necessary. Before leaving, Ethan looked back. The mansion seemed ordinary, aged but stable. No windows out of place, no sense of displacement. However, something had changed in Ethan. He brought no concrete evidence. There were no reliable records, valid measurements, or complete reports. But a clear choice lay before him. Denounce the house as structurally unsound, condemning it to demolition, or accept that the place operated under rules that could not be documented without causing collapse. The final revelation of the turning point was silent and internal. By trying to explain the house, he weakened it. By accepting it, he preserved the balance. Ethan got back into the car, started the engine, and drove off without looking at his watch again. He knew that from that moment on, he could no longer pretend that every structure could be completely understood. Some simply demand respect. Ethan didn't leave the property immediately. He remained seated in the car for a few minutes, observing the mansion in the rearview mirror. There was no sense of urgency nor complete relief, just a strange neutrality, as if the place had deliberately ended its interaction with him. When he called the insurance company, the call went through without interruption. He reported that the structural assessment would require more time, citing inconsistencies in the documentation and irregular renovations. He avoided any mention of the house's changeable behavior. The reaction on the other end of the line was practical. They requested a preliminary report within 48 hours. The immediate consequence was professional. Ethan would need to decide what to put on paper. He returned to the nearest town and stayed in a simple hotel. There, he tried to organize the remaining digital files. Most of them were unusable. Photos with corrupted metadata, videos without logical continuity, measurements that didn't add up. Any audit would have dismissed that material as faulty. The house had guaranteed that. Ethan reacted objectively. He drafted a concise technical report, pointing out historical documentation flaws, unapproved renovations, and the impossibility of accurate assessment without invasive interventions. The conclusion was ambiguous. The mansion did not present an immediate risk of collapse, but it could not be adequately evaluated according to current standards. The document neither condemned nor acquitted. Meanwhile, Harold became an indirect consequence. The next day, Ethan returned to the property, not to enter, but to return a clipboard he had forgotten outside. He found the truck parked in the same spot. Harold showed no surprise at seeing it. The interaction was brief. Harold said that other engineers had made different choices in the past. Some insisted on measuring, others tried to reform. None of them had stayed long enough to accomplish anything. Harold's reaction was not one of alarm, but of acceptance. Ethan realized he had become part of a silent chain of people who had learned to withdraw at the right moment. The internal consequences manifested themselves in a practical way. He began to avoid work involving historical properties with irregular documentation. He refused similar contracts in the following months without justifying the reason. His colleagues noticed the change in his behavior, but did not question it. The house continued to operate from a distance. On one particular occasion, Ethan received an automated email from the county informing him that the mansion had been temporarily removed from the list of properties for sale. No further explanation, no signature, just a status update. The reaction was not a surprise. The most significant impact occurred weeks later, when Ethan noticed a subtle shift in his spatial perception. In ordinary buildings, he began to notice poorly sized hallways, rooms with strange proportions, and doors positioned illogically. None of this frightened him. He simply recognized the patterns. I wasn't trying to correct them. The narrative progressed without direct confrontations because the main conflict had already changed form. It was no longer about surviving the house, but about living with the acquired knowledge. The mansion didn't haunt him. It didn't leave physical marks. It simply existed as a silent reference. The ultimate consequence of the turning point was clear. Ethan had lost the certainty that all of space could be dominated by human logic. And this loss did not bring chaos. It brought restraint. He didn't return to the mansion. He didn't need to. He knew the cycle would continue with other people, other attempts at control, other silent surrenders. The house didn't need defending. She was just waiting. Ethan's recovery didn't manifest as a sudden break from his old life, but as a continuous adjustment, almost imperceptible to those observing him from the outside. He didn't abandon engineering, didn't move to another city, and didn't report strange experiences to colleagues. He continued working, but in a different way. The first change occurred in the way he accepted projects. He began demanding full access to historical records before any evaluation. When these documents did not exist or presented excessive gaps, he refused the contract without insisting. Before, he would have accepted the challenge as a problem to be solved. Now, he recognized limitations. This decision was not motivated by fear, but by discernment. Ethan also adjusted his methodology. He reduced his reliance on obsessive measurements and began observing the actual use of spaces. In older buildings, he talked more with residents, caretakers, and building managers. He paid attention to which areas were avoided, which remained empty for no apparent reason. He didn't try to explain these choices. He simply recorded them as valid data. The protagonist's growth became visible in these practical actions. Another significant change was his relationship with time. Previously, each evaluation followed rigid schedules. Now, Ethan accepted delays when he perceived structural or human resistance. Instead of forcing deadlines, he redistributed steps, allowing the process to adjust. This behavior began to yield unexpected results, more consistent reports, fewer revisions, fewer conflicts with clients. Without realizing it, Ethan had incorporated a principle learned at the mansion. Stability arises from adaptation, not imposition. Harold's subplot found a discreet conclusion during this period. Months later, Ethan received a simple letter with no clear return address. Inside, only a recent photograph of the mansion, taken from a distance. The house remained intact, surrounded by the same trees. On the back, a short sentence: "It's still stable." Ethan did not respond. His personal growth was also reflected outside of work. He reorganized his apartment, removing furniture that blocked natural circulation. He opened up spaces, adjusted the lighting, and respected proportions he had previously ignored. He didn't follow rigid architectural rules. He followed sensations of flow. These changes were not conscious tributes to the institution, but practical responses to a new understanding. When thoughts about the mansion arose, they weren't accompanied by anxiety. They came as a functional reminder, an extreme example of a simple principle. Not every system accepts being dominated. Some require coexistence. The arc of overcoming challenges solidified when Ethan was invited to participate in a historical restoration project in another city. The building presented similar problems with confusing documentation. This time, Ethan accepted, but with clear conditions: no initial invasive intervention, prolonged observation, and active participation from the space's users. The project progressed without incident. The protagonist's transformation became evident in this contrast. The same man who, months before, had insisted on measuring every inch of the mansion was now leading a complex project without needing to control every variable. He had learned to grow within limits. The challenge wasn't about winning the house or uncovering its secret. It was a recognition that the need to understand everything can be as destructive as the fear of the unknown. Ethan moved forward, more aware, more restrained, carrying with him a lesson that didn't need explaining, only application. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, almost casually. An email from the county informed that the legal status of the mansion had been reassessed. The property would be included again on the list of properties to be inspected, following pressure from a real estate consortium interested in the land. The request was not a suggestion. It was a summons. Ethan's name was listed as a preferred evaluator. This decision quietly resolved the pending subplots. The house was not forgotten. The cycle would begin again. And somehow, the system had guided the process back to him. Ethan didn't reply immediately. He reread the email several times, paying close attention to the fine print. The consortium planned a swift intervention, with partial demolition if significant structural flaws were identified. The mansion wouldn't be renovated. It would be replaced. Tensions have returned, now with a clear deadline. He contacted Harold that same day. The number was still working. The conversation was short. Harold confirmed that there were new people hanging around the property, taking external measurements, marking trees, and photographing the land. He also said that the house was too quiet. This sentence accelerated the pace of the narrative. Ethan understood that his prolonged absence had created a vacuum. The house reacted less when he wasn't there, but it also didn't defend itself. Others were about to repeat the same mistakes, this time with aggressive machines and deadlines. The preparation for the climax lay in Ethan's choice. He would accept the call, not to measure, but to interfere in the process. His action would not be technical, but strategic. He gathered all available documents about the mansion, old records, inconclusive reports, his own ambiguous opinion. He wasn't seeking to prove the anomalous nature of the house. He was seeking to create legal obstacles, delays, and sufficient doubts to prevent a hasty decision. Margaret Whitmore's subplot found indirect resolution at this point. Ethan located an old will that imposed severe restrictions on structural alterations, without the unanimous approval of heirs who had never been officially declared non-existent. A legal vacuum. He attached the document to the case file. When Ethan returned to the property, the outside environment was different. Marks on the ground, warning tape, numbered stakes. The mansion, however, remained unchanged. No visible rearrangement, no noise, no apparent resistance. It was the calm before the collapse. Ethan walked through the front door for the first time in months. The interior was too still, every hallway in its proper place, every door leading to the expected space. The wall clock read 3:17. The final preparations took place in silence. Ethan walked through the rooms without instruments, without recordings. He touched walls, opened doors, followed familiar paths. The house responded consistently, as if it recognized the pattern of interaction. In the center of the building, he found the windowless room again. The table was empty this time. No documents, no corrections, just the clean surface. The message was clear. The decision was no longer up to the house. It was his. Ethan left the place at dusk, knowing that the next step, the confrontation between external logic and internal balance, was about to happen. The climax would not be a supernatural event. It would be a choice. The climax began the moment the consortium teams arrived at the property. Trucks, laser measuring equipment, drones and technicians with clipboards advanced across the land with the confidence of those who believe that everything can be translated into numbers. The mansion remained motionless, silent, almost indifferent. Ethan arrived soon after. He didn't try to physically prevent entry, nor did he make speeches. He limited himself to handing over documents, pointing out legal inconsistencies, and questioning deadlines. He created calculated delays. Each obstacle was small, but cumulative. Meanwhile, the technicians began external measurements and finally entered the house. It was there that the central conflict erupted. Inside the mansion, the equipment began to malfunction almost immediately. Scanners registered negative measurements in some rooms. Internal drones lost signal when crossing specific corridors. Digital floor plans generated in real time showed impossible overlaps. Technicians tried to recalibrate, replace equipment, and repeat procedures. The house did not attack. A casa invalidava. Ethan watched from a distance, not as a victim, but as someone who finally understood the mechanism. The climactic twist wasn't the revelation of a new power within the mansion, but the public exposure of what he had previously experienced alone. For the first time, the space's erratic behavior couldn't be dismissed as an individual error. The conflict reached its peak when the consortium's chief engineer ordered exploratory drilling in the ground floor. The impact of the drill echoed unevenly through the house, as if the sound were absorbed and returned out of rhythm. Within seconds, interior walls cracked. They didn't collapse, but rearranged themselves. Runners changed positions before watchful eyes. Doors opened onto spaces that hadn't existed minutes before. Panic wasn't immediate, but control was quickly lost. Technicians began to lose their bearings. Digital maps stopped reflecting reality. The house started to accelerate its responses, not out of aggression, but out of overload. Ethan entered. His presence was the deciding factor. He walked through the central hall without haste, ignoring collapsing measurements and raised voices. He climbed the main staircase, touched the worn handrail, and passed the clock stopped at 3:17. In the center of the house, the windowless room reappeared. The table was there again. Regarding it, there is only one document, a simple, hand-drawn plan, without a precise scale, without numerical measurements, only spatial relationships, entrances, flows, stability zones, and rejection areas. Ethan understood. The protagonist's transformation happened right there. He didn't try to explain what he saw. He didn't take photographs. He didn't present any evidence. He picked up the blueprint and left the room. Back on the ground floor, he found the chief engineer demanding immediate evacuation. Ethan handed over the document and simply said that the house could not be treated as an inert object. That insisting would result in functional, not structural collapse, something impossible to justify technically, but evident in practice. The plausible twist came to fruition when one of the technicians, in a panic, tried to run out and got lost inside his own house. He was found minutes later, unharmed, but in a room that wasn't listed in any records. That brought the intervention to a close. The teams were withdrawn. The consortium suspended operations indefinitely. There were no official explanations, only the claim of serious technical inconsistencies. The house calmed down. The corridors stabilized. The doors resumed their coherent functions. The clock remained still. Ethan left last, not as someone who escaped, but as someone who negotiated. The climax didn't end with destruction or explicit victory. It ended with mutual recognition. The house had been protected not by force, but by understanding. And Ethan had definitively ceased to be someone who measures the world and became someone who learns when not to. When he closed the door, he felt no relief. It felt like something was ending. The official suspension of the project was communicated weeks later through a short and impersonal report. The real estate consortium withdrew its interest, citing technical and legal infeasibility. There were no new requests for expert evaluation. The mansion returned to the state of administrative limbo that had always protected it. Ethan watched the outcome from a distance. He delivered his final report to the county, this time more direct than ever. The document made no mention of anomalies, but made it clear that any attempt at structural standardization in that building would result in loss of functionality and unpredictable risks. It did not recommend demolition, nor did it recommend renovation. Only minimal maintenance and detachment. That was the most truth the system would accept. With that, Ethan's professional arc ended quietly. He didn't gain public recognition or suffer any sanctions. His name ceased to be associated with problematic properties. He became a reliable, yet selective technician, someone who knew when to say no. The most lasting consequence, however, was silent. Months later, Ethan drove past the road leading to the mansion by chance. There were no signs, no traffic. The trees still formed the same closed corridor. He didn't stop the car. He felt no need to. The house was still there, but it was no longer part of his route. The narrative arc of the mansion also closed, without grand explanations. There were no public testimonies, journalistic investigations, or local rumors. The house remained outside the collective memory, existing only in forgotten records and postponed decisions. This absence was his way of surviving. Ethan moved forward with a different understanding of the world. He began to respect invisible boundaries in spaces, people, and systems. He no longer sought to dominate complex structures, he sought to coexist with them. The protagonist's journey didn't make him braver or stronger, but more attentive. He learned that insisting on answers can be just as destructive as ignoring important questions. The mansion didn't defeat him, she redefined it. And this result, although discreet, was definitive. Years passed, and the mansion remained untouched, silent and still, invisible to the city's routine. Ethan pursued his career, always mindful of the invisible boundaries that experience had taught him. On some nights, he still remembered the corridors that shifted position and the rooms that appeared out of nowhere. He wondered if anyone else would ever realize that certain structures require more than logic to be understood. The mansion continued to wait, not for curious onlookers, but for those who had the patience to learn to respect its own rhythms. If you felt immersed in this enigmatic mansion, share your interpretation of what really happens within those corridors and rooms that defy logic. Have you ever visited a place that seems alive or that changes with your presence? Share your experience in the comments, and let's discover together if reality can be as strange as fiction. Like and share this account so that others can feel the same suspense and tension that Ethan faced. Every reaction helps keep these mysterious stories alive that challenge our perception of the world.